questions, none submitted. Finance, budget report. Administration will update the board on the budget. This item provides an opportunity for the board's information and discussion.
Welcome back. This isn't good when it takes two computers to do a budget report.
It's getting that complicated. Well, good evening, President Rohde, Vice President Logan, Superintendent Thompson, Dr. Irving, members of the board. As anticipated, it was a fast and furious period of time at the legislative level. Certainly a lot of activity going on in just the last week, particularly the last 48 hours. So we've heard a little bit about it tonight, but I thought we'd talk a little bit about specifically what's happened. This House and Senate passed what's known as Senate Bill 423. That is the new school finance formula early Sunday morning, just about at the last possible moment they could possibly pass without adjourning. The bill will be sent to the governor, who has indicated he will sign this bill. The legislature has adjourned until April 26th, with the sine die session set for May 4th. What this date frame means is that really there's no possible way for the Supreme Court to come back with any sort of decision with time in the regular session for the legislature to take any action. So if the Supreme Court would come back and say it's not constitutional, we would be looking at some sort of special session. So what is in Senate Bill 423 that is of interest? A lot. We are still digesting a lot of the details in this formula. There is a lot of specifics related to transportation. There's some transportation resolution. There's several equity fixes. A whole laundry list of things that we're going to bring back to you. We want to make sure that we've vetted it very fully before we present it to the board. And KSDE just came out this evening with their adjusted runs based on what the formula actually means. So, and literally like 5 minutes ago, that's why I brought up my computer, because I wanted to be able to answer some questions with the most up-to-date data that we have. But rather than going through all of that right now, just know that there is a lot of detail in that in this formula. A lot of problems are resolved, particularly related to the equity violations that the court found with Senate Bill 19, the previous finance formula. But let's talk a little bit about money. For 2018-19, Senate Bill 423 does appropriate $26 million more in general state aid. This is on top of what Senate Bill 19 already had in the formula for the second year of that formula. So it is an accumulation formula that does count the money that was already in Senate Bill 19. So $26 million more in general state aid, $32.4 million in special ed state aid, bringing that total to $44 million in special ed aid. That doesn't bring us to the 92% that's required, but it does present a good step forward. And then $6 million more in the local option budget state aid, and we'll talk a little bit more about the LOB here in just a few minutes. Specific appropriations within Senate Bill 423 for the first year. As was mentioned earlier, there is a mental health intervention pilot that will occur. It's $10 million, but $2.5 million is actually set aside for a software program to administer the pilot. So it's $7.5 million focused on, I believe it's five partners, Wichita being one of them, and Wichita would partner with our own community health services to serve at 23 schools. That's kind of the framework that we'll see with this pilot. $2.8 million has been set aside for all high school students to take the ACT exam once, and the opportunity to take the ACT work key assessments, 3 of them, at no cost to the high school student. There was also a small set aside for the JAG program, particularly as it relates to foster programs. $15,000. We're one of 3 districts that would get a little bit of that. And then $500,000 for a teacher mentor program. And those are very specific appropriations, cannot be spent for other items. They have to be focused on those particular purposes. Okay, so there's a lot of numbers here, but this is kind of the 5-year look at what Senate Bill 423 brings to the table. This is including those Senate Bill 19 figures, so it is an accumulated number per year. The base, which used to be the base aid per pupil, now is called the BASE, increases to $4,900 for 18-19. Big asterisk, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And it increases every year. And the first year, there's $189 million in the formula for education, and then the following year, the base kind of settles in at $95 million, and then special ed, $7.5 million, $2 million for 4-year-old at risk, and some supplemental general state aid. It's $629 million, give or take, over 5 years total money. From Senate Bill 19 to this bill, it's an additional $520 million. So when you hear those two numbers kind of being talked about, that's the difference. The $629 million includes what was already appropriated under Senate Bill 19. The $520, give or take, is additional money through Senate Bill 423. And I think that's an important designation to understand. The general rule of thumb when you're looking at statewide numbers for Wichita is that we are about 10% of the figure. So if you're looking at 18-19, you can kind of guesstimate that we would be looking at about $18.9 million of that. And then in the subsequent years, we would be looking at around $10 million, $10 to $11 million. Certainly, particularly in year one, that's a sizable chunk of money. Certainly in the outlying years, that's still a lot of money. I think the important thing to note here is, and we've talked about this in the last couple presentations from a budget perspective, is our district has tremendous needs. We're coming out of 9 years of cuts, this year being kind of the outlier on that front. So, and you heard earlier that we are 96% efficient. It's not like we have a lot of low-hanging fruit to push the outcomes that the board is wanting to achieve. So this 5-year expansion of funding, if you think about that in year 2, 3, 4, and 5, it's a $10 million increase in funding for us, $10 million after fixed cost increases. There isn't a lot left to get a lot of lift on outcomes. So no question, it's a sizable chunk of money. It's just, we are still backpedaling from years of cuts. So for us to catch up and really make an impact on outcomes, $10 to $11 million in those subsequent years is just not going to go too far. And I thought we'd take just a minute to kind of point out what our share of this 5-year plan looks like. Okay, the LOB, and I put this one piece of clip art in here. I've tried to keep my clip art to a minimum today, but I had to put in the shell game picture because I will say the intent a few years was supposed to be to simplify the school funding formula. Well, if this is simplification, we're in some big trouble, because what they're in this formula, what they're doing is that we were at 4,006 base aid. We're going to 4,900 base aid. On its surface, that seems to be a large increase. But what they're doing is they're taking part of the LOB and counting it as base state aid. So we're basically inflating that base aid per pupil, but we're not getting any additional lift from the 4,006 to the 4,900. It's more money. It's just not that sizable amount of money you would think by getting that kind of increase per pupil. I believe the intent here is so that the court will recognize the LOB as part of the state's contribution. It looks interesting on paper. It does mean that every year from this point forward, there's going to be a big asterisk by 18-19 to have to explain why we are at $4,900 and why that didn't generate more funding for schools. And I attempted to recalculate this about 5 times, and I got part of the way there, and then I finally gave up because the language is so convoluted. They've already acknowledged that there's an error in the bill. They'll have to come back and fix that when they come back, related to how this LOB language is written. So there's more to come on that. The Supreme Court timeline, just to recap what we talked about last month, April 30th, the briefs are due, and there's response briefs due 10 days after that. The Supreme Court is set to hear oral arguments by May 22nd, and that they've promised a decision by June 30th. The same possibilities still exist for us should the Supreme Court reject that finance formula as being inadequate and not equitable, and or not equitable. Supreme Court rules in time for the legislature to go back and fix before June 30th. That will still require, at this point, a special session. Their Supreme Court grants an extension after June 30th while the legislature returns for a special session. Or again, the possibility does exist that a shutdown is possible and in July until a formula is developed that meets constitutional muster. And why this possibility still exists, if you look at the chart, the proposed new funding of $500 million and change, or the proposed total funding of $629 million, there's still a very significant gap between those figures and what all of the cost studies that have been done recently and in the past, adjusted for inflation, tell the court is necessary for schools to reach those outcomes under the Roe standards. So there's still a very significant gap. Not that the money presented was not significant. There's just still, if we're going to get where they want us to go, that's a big chunk of chart to have to get through. So that's the concern, obviously, and why we're still talking about the possibility of shutdown, is that we're concerned that the court's going to look at this gap and say it's not adequate. And these studies include the Taylor studies that were referenced earlier, the legislative post-audit from a few years ago, adjusted for inflation, the Alvarez and Marcel study, adjusted for inflation, and then an independent study done by a group called Myers, Pikus, and Auden. Again, all of those being relatively close in nature, in that $1.5 billion, $1.6 billion, up to $2 billion, not too far off. So that the court will look at kind of that data, which has already been put into the record, compared to what Senate Bill 423 has. On a slightly better note, the March revenues were up again, beating estimates by $40 million. The state has collected $314 million above revenue estimates for the fiscal year, $670 million above this time last year. So that continues to be a bright spot in the state, that the tax plan is working and continues to raise revenues. Sustainability should be made clearer when we get to the April 20th date, when they will come out with their new revenue estimates, and we'll see if they're anticipating this to be a sustainable growth pattern. So anxious for that date. Okay, jumping just a little bit to our fiscal year 19 budget planning. These are the needs that we have identified to date. This hasn't really changed from last month. What we did here, though, is we took your strategic themes and we tried to make sure that the items that we had identified so far aligned with what the board had identified as important themes as we move forward in the budgeting process. Remember that we talked about we weren't going to be able to really budget around your goals, but we wanted to make sure that where we were putting funds were in line with what the board wants for the district as far as placement of resources, allocation of resources. And for the most part, I think we're pretty much right on where we need to be. Our calendar change, pre-K expansion, continued expansion of learning centers for graduation rates, the behavior work, and the continuum of services in that area, recruitment and retention through compensation, and then there's a few of those items that we have to cover, such as the transportation contract increases, textbooks, and technology that all align resources with the support of student success. So I think for the most part, we're somewhat aligned with those themes that you've identified with our current needs. If we look back at fiscal year 18 budget priorities, we kind of did the same exercise where we took that list of items from last year and made sure they still fit within your themes. And I think they do, but what I would like from the board for May is for you to kind of review this information to make sure that nothing needs to come off, items don't need to be put on, or if there's any sort of reprioritization that needs to occur. Again, we're going to be somewhat at the mercy of this whole legislative Supreme Court process as we're building this budget. So we're going to be hurrying up and waiting as we get to that final deadline. And then we're going to be, okay, here's your budget forms, throw your budget together and get it out by your August 25th date. So we just want to make sure that we have as clear of marching orders as we can get, that this is where the board wants to put priority as far as allocation of resources. So again, kind of just to wrap it up, the fiscal year 19 budget planning next steps would be for the Board of Education to provide any changes to budget priorities in May. From our side, we would be continuing to collect the data on fixed cost increases, hopefully coming back to you with maybe some first estimates of what those numbers look like. And then kind of just to recap our current situation, and that the legislature has passed a new school finance formula that does put an additional $500+ million into education over the next 5 years. The question of whether that formula meets both constitutional adequacy and equity will be in the hands of the Supreme Court. Fiscal year 19 budget needs and fiscal year 18 budget priorities at this point seem to align with the district's strategic themes. If any changes of those, we'll look at in May and incorporate into the budget for fiscal year 19. And I'll stand for questions.
We'll start out with Julie.
Remind us how much budget cuts were.
Budget cuts and budget reallocations, that would include moving items from the general fund into capital. That accumulation was close to $100 million for us.
So even though we have this, it doesn't even catch up with where the cuts were.
No, we're not going to catch up.
Yeah, we're not going to catch up. So in addition to not meeting the study amounts, we also aren't even going to catch up relative to the money that was cut.
Correct.
You're going to get off easy tonight.
Sorry.
Thank you for your
Thank
hard
you.
work. Oh, I'm sorry. Cheryl decided.
Yeah, I really have a question for Dr. Thompson. The budget priorities that we set for this year, obviously, many of our members are new for next year. Would it be possible to send those last two slides that you put together with the budget priorities and the things that we put in place so that everybody can have some discussion about that and thought about it before we have a discussion at the table?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it.